The Dreadnought. There is a practice in certain Space Marine chapters of speaking to the dead. Not in the manner of rituals or supplication, not prayers offered to spirits that may or may not hear them, but direct conversation with a machine that stands 4 meters tall and has been on continuous service since before most of the Imperium's current institutions existed. The warrior inside the machine is not dead, technically. The word for what he is would require several paragraphs of philosophical qualification to get right, and Space Marines are not generally given to philosophical qualification when there is a battle to be fought. What they know is this: the voice that comes through the vocalizer is the voice of someone who has been there, who has seen things that no living brother can now claim to have seen, who carries in the wreckage of a body inside that sarcophagus, a continuity of experience stretching back to eras that the chapter's most ancient scrolls only partially describe. They call these individuals their ancients. They call the machines that house them dreadnoughts. And the relationship between the chapter and its dreadnoughts is one of the more genuinely strange things in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Simultaneously an act of reverence and an act of necessity, an honor that is also a sentence, a preservation that is also a kind of captivity. This is the story of the Dreadnought. Not the specifications or the weapon loadouts, though those matter, and they will be addressed, but the nature of what the Dreadnought actually is, what it means to be inside one, and what the Imperium's willingness to do this to its greatest heroes says about the civilization that built them. The honor and the cost. The first thing to understand about the Dreadnought is that the warrior inside it is still alive. This is not obvious from the outside, and it is not always easy to hold on to from the inside. The machine walks. The machine fights. The machine's weapons tear through enemy armor, and its sarcophagus absorbs damage that would vaporize a tank crew. But at the center of the machine, where the amniotic sarcophagus sits embedded in the walker's chest, there is a man. What remains of a man? A torso and a head and whatever the apothecaries could preserve of the nervous system, suspended in fluid that is described in the technical literature as nutrient-rich, and in the personal accounts of those who have experienced it as numbingly cold, like breathing thick oil. The stabbing input cords connect what is left of the pilot to the machine's systems directly, hardwired into the spine and the brain, translating the warrior's intent into the Dreadnought's motion. When he decides to move the arm moves. When he targets something, the weapon locks onto it. The machine is his body, in the functional sense that matters for the purposes of killing the Imperium's enemies, and in a much more uncomfortable sense when he tries to remember what his own hands felt like. He cannot leave. This is the thing that the Dreadnought honor never quite says plainly in the chapter ceremonies or the chaplain's sermons about glorious continuance of service. The warrior who is entombed in a Dreadnought is entombed. The sarcophagus is not a vehicle he pilots and then disembarks from. It is where he lives, in suspension, for the centuries or millennia between battles. If the Dreadnought is destroyed, the Space Marines fighting alongside it will risk their lives to recover the chassis, not because the vehicle is valuable, though it is, but because the brother inside may still be alive. And the least the chapter can do is bring him home to the mausoleum for the final rest he has been denied for so long. Denied is not a word the chapter uses in these contexts. The official framing is honor, continuance, preservation of the chapter's greatest warriors. These framings are not dishonest. They are accurate. The warrior who is entombed in a Dreadnought is genuinely honored, genuinely valued, genuinely useful, genuinely preserved. The problem is that all of these things are simultaneously true, and the word captivity is also accurate. and the Imperium does not generally hold those two truths in the same sentence if it can avoid it. Not every candidate is willing. Some are. Some of the greatest names in Dreadnought history accepted entombment with equanimity or genuine enthusiasm, understanding what they were agreeing to and finding the continuation of service worth the cost. Some did not have the opportunity to consent in any meaningful sense, their wounds so severe and the decision made so quickly by the chapter's command that the first indication they received of what had happened was waking up in the machine. And some warriors, when offered the choice, refused, asked to be allowed to die with their brothers, to receive the Emperor's peace rather than the Emperor's eternal service. And the chapter's response to this refusal varies by tradition and by the specific circumstances of the specific warrior's value to the chapter. The Dreadnought is one of the most honest expressions of what the Imperium actually is. An entity that does not let go of things it needs, that has a very particular definition of mercy, and that honors its greatest servants by demanding everything from them, indefinitely, without any clear provision for when the demand ends. What it is like inside. The amniotic fluid fills the lungs. This is the first thing that surprises those who have never thought carefully about the technical specifications. The warrior breathes it. He breathes cold, thick, nutrient-dense fluid that his modified physiology can process. And the sensation of it is one of the things that the pilot must learn not to focus on. Because focusing on it leads to the body's natural panic response. And the natural panic response does not help when you are trying to control a machine whose movements translate directly from your intent. He must focus on the machine. The stabbing input cords do not make this optional. If the mind goes inward, toward the broken body at the center of it all, the machine's systems begin to drift. And the machine drifting in the wrong direction during a battle is a problem that will be experienced not by the pilot, but by the Space Marines fighting alongside him. The discipline required to keep attention outward, toward the sensor feeds and the targeting data and the Vox channels carrying the voices of his brothers, is a form of meditation that the most experienced pilots develop over decades into something almost automatic. The newest pilots have not developed this yet, and the newest pilots have the most recent and most vivid memories of what their bodies felt like before. The voice is something else the chronicles describe with consistent discomfort. The synthesized vocalization that the Dreadnought produces is designed to approximate the pilot's original voice. But the approximation is imperfect in ways that are difficult to specify, but immediately apparent to brothers who knew the warrior before. Something in the timbre, something in the way the pauses fall. What sounds like laughter sometimes comes out as the cycling of autocannon rounds, and this is treated in the technical literature as a machine quirk rather than a loss, and in the personal accounts of the warriors who hear it as something considerably more difficult to categorize. The pilot can communicate. This is important and also inadequate. He can speak to his brothers through the vocalizer. He can receive information through the sensor feeds. He can participate in briefings and offer tactical assessments and answer questions about the battles he fought 10 centuries ago as if they were yesterday, because for him they largely are. What he cannot do is feel the things that the body feels. He cannot feel the sun, except as a data point in the environmental monitoring. He cannot taste or smell, he cannot touch. The sense of impact when the close combat arm strikes an enemy is transmitted as data rather than sensation, and the data tells him that he has hit something hard enough to kill it. But the information that arrives through a neural interface is categorically different from the information that arrives through a hand. Some pilots retain their full selves across the centuries. The oldest dreadnoughts in the most storied chapters are individuals who have developed a relationship with the machine that has made it genuinely theirs, who have learned every quirk of the Sarcophagus system, who have customized the sensor arrays to emphasize the inputs they find most useful, who have found something that functions like comfort in the specific combination of machine self that they have become. These are the ones who speak with the clarity and wit and specific personality of a person who has chosen this existence rather than been subjected to it. They tend to be the ones who sleep most peacefully between battles, who make the transition in and out of suspension with the equanimity of someone who has made peace with their circumstances. Others fragment. The mind, over sufficient centuries, under sufficient isolation and deprivation of human sensation, begins to find the edges of its own coherence. Old dreadnoughts sometimes speak with an overlapping quality, different layers of the same consciousness responding to the same question from different eras of their very long experience. They are not dangerous in the way of the Hellbrute. The chaos corruption that produces that specific madness is absent in loyalist dreadnoughts, but they are difficult to interface with, and the chapter's chaplains and librarians maintain regular vigil over the oldest sarcophagi to catch the early signs of disintegration. Between battles, dreadnoughts are placed in suspension. They do not dream. This is perhaps the most significant mercy the Imperium has managed to build into the system, and whether it was designed as mercy or simply as a technical necessity of maintaining the pilot's neural coherence over very long periods is not entirely clear from the records. The darkness of suspension is different from sleep in ways that pilots who have experienced both describe as fundamentally difficult to compare. It is not unconsciousness. It is closer to the absence of time, to being nowhere, to the space between one moment and the next that has been expanded to fill centuries. When they are woken, they return immediately. There is no disorientation, no grogginess, no process of reorientation. The battle that is happening now, and the pilot who was placed in suspension at the end of the last battle connects to the present battle with the directness of someone who has merely looked away for a moment and looked back. This is simultaneously one of the most useful things about a dreadnought in tactical terms, and one of the most unsettling things about them in human terms. They do not experience the centuries. They experience only the battles, connected by the nothing of suspension, an existence measured in conflicts rather than in years. The varieties. The dreadnought as a category encompasses considerable variation in both form and function, reflecting 10,000 years of technological development, chapter-specific modifications, and the specific needs of different tactical situations. The Castroferum pattern, what most people picture when they hear the word dreadnought, is the classic form. Heavily built, with the rectangular torso that gives it a squared-off silhouette, recognizable hundreds of meters away, armed typically with a dreadnought close combat weapon on one arm and a ranged weapon on the other, capable of shifting between the two as the tactical situation requires. The Castroferum has been in service since before the Horus Heresy and remains in widespread use across the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Its age is a double-edged quality. The design has been refined across centuries, and its capabilities are well understood. But the oldest Castroferum chassis are increasingly difficult to maintain. Their machine spirits occasionally erratic in ways that require careful management from the chapter's tech marines. The Venerable Dreadnought is not a separate variant, so much as a designation earned through longevity and distinguished service. A Castroferum or other pattern that has been in service for long enough to carry the weight of multiple centuries of experience. Venerable Dreadnoughts are the ones the chapter consults rather than simply commands. The pilot inside has fought in wars that living battle brothers know only from records. They have faced enemies that no longer exist in campaigns that shaped the current state of the galaxy, and the tactical knowledge they carry is not the kind that can be transmitted through a briefing or reconstructed from campaign records. It lives in the pilot's experience, available to the chapter on those occasions when the chapter decides the situation warrants waking the Ancient. The Venerable Dreadnoughts are woken sparingly. The older the pilot, the greater the effort required to rouse them, and the greater the damage done to the coherence that centuries of suspension have preserved. The Contemptor pattern predates the current era significantly, originating before the Horus Heresy and featuring systems drawn from the Mechanicum's Legio Cybernetica. The Contemptor is faster and more sophisticated than the Castroferrum, incorporating an atomantic arc reactor and defensive energy field systems that make it significantly more survivable than its more common counterpart. Most Contemptors still in service belong to the older chapters and are treated as sacred relics rather than frontline assets. The technology required to maintain them is difficult to source, and the pilots inside them are among the oldest living beings in the Imperium. When a Contemptor takes the field, the battle around it often stops for a moment on both sides, which is recognition of a different kind than tactical respect. The Redemptor is the newest pattern, developed during the Primaris program and representing a significant departure from the older designs. It is larger than the Castroferrum, more powerful, faster, more sophisticated in its sensor and weapons systems. The neural link technology is advanced enough that the pilot can exercise control with surprising dexterity and speed, despite being in a sarcophagus considerably smaller than those of older patterns. This advanced interface comes with a cost that is described in the technical literature as a matter of continued observation and assessment. The whisper in the chapters that field Redemptors is more direct. The machine runs hot, the neural load is intense, and some pilots have burned out in ways that required the sarcophagus to be replaced rather than simply serviced. The Redemptor demands more of its pilot than older patterns, and what it demands is not recoverable once given. The Leviathan pattern is the heaviest, a siege weapon rather than a battlefield asset, designed to operate in environments that would kill anything lighter through sheer accumulated damage. The Leviathan absorbs punishment at a scale that makes other dreadnoughts seem fragile. The pilot inside a Leviathan is operating in conditions that the neural interface designers describe as intense, even by dreadnought standards. And the long-term effects on the pilot's cognitive coherence are not entirely well documented, partly because the kind of battles Leviathans are deployed in do not always produce pilots who can subsequently be interviewed. Chapter Traditions. The Dreadnought is not one thing across all the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Each chapter's specific culture and theological traditions shape what it means to be entombed, what the relationship between the pilot and the chapter looks like, and what the Dreadnought is understood to represent in the deepest sense. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters have the Furioso Dreadnought, a variant designed specifically for the intense close combat fighting that the Iynx Legion's traditions emphasize. The Furioso trades long-range firepower for melee lethality, built around the specific philosophy that the Blood Angels' way of war is personal and immediate, rather than distant and calculated. The Blood Angels have another Dreadnought variant that no other chapter shares, the Death Company Dreadnought. A pilot who awakens from suspension, already in the grip of the Black Rage, the psychic curse that affects Blood Angels as they approach death, filling their minds with Sanguinius's last moments at the War Master's hands, cannot be used as a coordinated tactical asset. He can be used as a weapon. The Death Company Dreadnoughts are released in battle under the supervision of the chaplains who manage the Death Company, pointed at the enemy and given the space to express the grief and fury that the Black Rage produces. They are not commanded. They are deployed. The distinction matters. The Space Wolves have a relationship with their dreadnoughts that reflects the chapter's broader theology of death and honor and the continuance of the warrior spirit. Every Space Wolf entombed in a dreadnought is understood to be fighting until Morkai, the wolf at the threshold between the worlds, finally claims his due. This is not resignation, but defiance. The specific defiance of a culture that has always understood death as something to be faced rather than avoided. The Space Wolves' most famous dreadnought is also the most famous in the entire Imperium. Bjorn the Fell-Handed fought alongside Lemon Russ himself during the Horus Heresy, one of the Primarch's most trusted warriors, and was at his side through the events that shaped the current age. He was mortally wounded and entombed in a dreadnought chassis at the end of that era, and he has been woken periodically in the 10,000 years since. Not frequently, because the effort required to rouse him grows with each century, and because the Space Wolves treat his periods of waking as something close to sacred events. He is the oldest living loyalist space marine in the Imperium. His memories extend to the Great Crusade, to the Primarchs as living beings rather than legends, to the politics and conflicts and specific texture of an age that everything the Imperium currently knows about is reconstructed from records and the interpretations of records. When Bjorn speaks about the Horus Heresy, he is not repeating what the chronicles say, he is remembering. The Iron Hands present perhaps the most philosophically interesting case for the Dreadnought, because the Iron Hands have a theological position on flesh and machine that makes the Dreadnought not a compromise but an aspiration. The chapter's foundational philosophy, that flesh is weak, that the machine is superior, that the progressive replacement of organic tissue with augmentation is the path toward the perfection that Ferrus Manius represented before the heresy took him, means that the Dreadnought is not a captivity but a logical endpoint. The Iron Hand who is entombed has shed the last significant portion of his mortal flesh. He has become, in the framework his chapter considers ideal, substantially what the chapter has always said its warriors should aspire to be. An Iron Hand's venerable dreadnought does not grieve for what he has lost. He is home, the Hellbrute. The traitor legions have dreadnoughts too. What they have done with them over 10,000 years of chaos corruption is one of the darker aspects of the lore surrounding this subject. When the traitor legions fled to the Eye of Terror after the Horus Heresy, they brought their dreadnoughts with them. In the years immediately following the heresy, these pilots were in the same position as their loyalist counterparts, warriors entombed in machines, continuing to fight, carrying the weight of what had happened. But the Eye of Terror is a place where the warp bleeds into real space without the barriers that maintain the distinction between material and immaterial, and the effects on the machines and the pilots within them have been consistent and terrible over the ensuing millennia. The traitor legion's technological capacity has declined. They cannot maintain the sarcophagi with the precision that loyalist chapters can. The pilots have been awake through centuries that the loyalist dreadnoughts spent in suspension, because the traitor legions cannot always reliably achieve suspension or do not always bother. The warp energy saturating the Eye of Terror seeps into the machine systems and the sarcophagi and the neural links, producing the specific combination of corruption and degradation that the 41st millennium calls a Hellbrute. The Hellbrute is what happens when the isolation and the pain and the warp exposure and the centuries of continuous wakefulness have consumed the pilot's mind, and the corruption has remade what remains into something that serves chaos rather than the Emperor. The pilot is still in there. This is the important and horrible detail. The Hellbrute is not an unmanned machine or a demonic possession in the conventional sense. There is a being at its center, experiencing whatever is now being experienced inside a sarcophagus that has not been properly maintained in centuries, and that carries the warp-charged mutation of 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror. What that experience consists of is not something the records are able to describe accurately, because the beings who have experienced it do not produce descriptions that can be straightforwardly interpreted. The Hellbrute is unpredictable in ways that make it both more dangerous and less useful as a military asset than a loyalist dreadnought. It cannot be relied upon to direct its violence in the direction the commanding Chaos Space Marines want. It does not take the field in the controlled deployment of a unit. It is released, pointed generally at the enemy, and left to do whatever it does, which is usually extremely destructive, and occasionally as destructive to its own side as to the opposition. The traitor legions accept this because a released Hellbrute is still a very effective agent of destruction, and also because, for some of the more actively sadistic elements of Chaos Space Marine culture, the Hellbrute is not just a weapon. It is a demonstration of what happens to those who fail, or in some cases what happens to those who succeed too visibly and attract the wrong kind of attention from their own commanders. Being placed in a dreadnought sarcophagus in the service of chaos is explicitly, in some legions, a punishment. The loyalist warrior entombed in a dreadnought is honored and imprisoned simultaneously. The traitor legion's equivalent is simply imprisonment. What they know. The strategic value of a Venerable Dreadnought is not primarily its weapon systems, formidable as those are. It is the pilot inside. The chapter that has a Venerable Dreadnought in its mausoleum has access, in principle, to a continuous thread of first-hand experience stretching back to eras that are otherwise only accessible through records of varying reliability. The Dreadnought who fought at the chapter's founding knows what the founding battles actually looked like, as distinct from what the chronicles say they looked like. The Dreadnought who served during the Age of Apostasy has a perspective on that period that does not require historical interpretation. The one who was woken during the 13th Black Crusade and fought at Cardia before it fell carries in the wreckage of his memory something that no historian can reconstruct. What it felt like to be there, as a space marine, watching something irreplaceable end. This knowledge is not always coherent. The oldest pilots have the longest experience, and also the longest time in which that experience has been subjected to the fragmenting effects of centuries in suspension. They speak in overlapping layers sometimes, different eras of memory surfacing in the same sentence, different battles that felt equally present in the moment of fighting, layered on top of each other in the telling. The chaplains and librarians who maintain vigil over the oldest sarcophagi develop skills in interpretation that are not taught in any formal curriculum. The ability to distinguish which layer of the pilot's consciousness is currently speaking, what era the current response is drawing from, when the apparent answer to a tactical question is actually the answer to a tactical question from 8 centuries ago that had a similar shape. The advice they give is still worth seeking. The chapter master who sits with the Venerable Dreadnought and asks about the nature of the enemy they are about to face, or the tactics that worked against a particular type of threat, or what the Primarch was actually like as a commander when there was still a Primarch to command, is not conducting a historical exercise. They are consulting a being who has seen more war than any living member of the chapter, who has direct experience of things that cannot be learned any other way, and who is still fully capable of forming coherent assessments and strategic recommendations, despite everything the centuries have done to the coherence of their experience. The Dreadnought is the chapter's memory made mobile, made armored, made capable of one more battle in defense of the things it remembers. There is something genuinely extraordinary about this, even by the standards of the 41st millennium, which contains considerable competition for extraordinary. The scale of the thing. A Dreadnought at full stride is 4 meters of ceramite and adamantium, and ancient grievance in motion. The ground shakes under each step in a way that is distinct from the movement of tracked vehicles. More immediate, more purposeful. The specific impact of something walking rather than rolling. The sound it makes is the sound of a very large machine that was designed to make an impression on the people watching it approach, which it does. The weapons it carries are calibrated to the same scale. The assault cannon spinning up on one arm produces a sound that penetrates hearing protection designed for conventional heavy weapons fire. The power fist on the other arm, when it closes on an enemy vehicle, does not damage the vehicle. It deforms it, in the way that a human hand deforms clay, with the force of a hydraulic press and the intentionality of a warrior who has been doing this for 2 centuries and knows exactly where to apply pressure to produce the specific failure he wants. The Lascanon variant burns through armor at ranges that make infantry engagement feel almost incidental. The Flamer variant is used in environments where the tactical objective is to leave nothing standing, and the specific character of that nothing is irrelevant. None of the weapons are the most dangerous thing about the Dreadnought. The most dangerous thing is the pilot, who has been fighting wars for longer than most space marine companies have existed as organizations, who has developed over centuries the specific combination of tactical patience and applied violence that only extremely long experience in extremely high-intensity combat produces. The Dreadnought that walks onto a battlefield does not react the way a newer combatant reacts. It assesses. It has seen this configuration of enemy forces before, or something close enough to it that the experience translates. It knows which unit is the priority target, which approach reduces the risk to the brothers fighting alongside it, which enemy commander is the one whose removal will most damage the opposing force's coherence. It knows these things not from a tactical cogitator running probability assessments, but from having made these determinations successfully, in the field many times over. The enemy who looks at a Dreadnought and sees a large armored walker is seeing it wrong. The enemy who looks at a Dreadnought and sees a Space Marine veteran of incomprehensible experience in a machine body that amplifies what that experience can do is seeing it closer to correctly. The distinction affects how you fight it, which is one reason why fighting Dreadnoughts tends to go badly for opponents who have not fought them before, and why fighting Dreadnoughts tends to go better for opponents who have, because having fought one and survived is its own form of very useful education. The long service. The Dreadnought sleeps between battles. It does not dream. It wakes when the chapter needs it. And the chapter tries to need it only when the situation genuinely warrants the disruption of the Ancients' rest. Because waking costs something. Each awakening takes a little more from the coherence that the centuries have preserved. And there is a finite number of awakenings available even to the most resilient pilot. The chapter that wakes its venerable Dreadnought for every engagement of middling significance is spending a resource that cannot be replaced. The pilot, waking into a new battle, does not know how much time has passed since the last one. The sensor feeds tell him the date. The chapter's briefing tells him what is happening. But the subjective experience of the interval is the nothing of suspension, and the nothing that separates this battle from the last one could be a year or a century. Both have happened. Both feel the same from the inside. The greatest dreadnoughts have watched the Imperium change. They have fought under conditions that no longer exist, with weapons that are now ceremonial relics, alongside brothers who have been dead for hundreds of years. They have watched the chapter's culture evolve around their unchanging core. They have seen chapter masters come and go, doctrinal debates begin and end, old enemies return in new forms, and the specific quality of the galaxy's darkness increase incrementally but unmistakably across the scope of their very long experience. They have not changed, except in the ways that very long experience changes anything that is capable of learning. The principles they fight by are the same principles they held when they were interred. The loyalty is the same loyalty. The grief, for those old enough to have known what was lost at the heresy, remains as fresh as grief that has been waiting for 10,000 years to be properly processed and has not found the opportunity. Bjorn the Fell-Handed is woken once every 1,000 years or so, when the space wolves need him most, or when the ceremony of his waking itself is the point. He remembers Lemon Russ. He remembers the Great Crusade. He remembers a galaxy that was being united rather than merely defended, when the Emperor's purpose was expansion rather than survival, when the Primarchs walked among men and the future seemed, however briefly, like something that was being built rather than simply endured. That memory is in there, in the sarcophagus, in the cold fluid, in the ancient machine standing in its cradle in the Space Wolves' mausoleum, waiting for the next call to service. The wolves say Bjorn is the oldest living space marine in the Imperium. They mean it as an honor. It is also the most concise possible description of what the Dreadnought system is, and what it costs, and what it asks of the men inside the machines. They are still alive. They have always been still alive. That is the whole point, and also the whole problem. Rylanor and the Long Vigil. There is a story about a dreadnought that captures something essential about what these machines are, and it is worth telling directly. Rylanor the Unyielding was the Ancient of Rites of the Emperor's Children Legion, one of the 3 Legion's most honored warriors, entombed in a Contemptor-patterned dreadnought chassis before the Horus Heresy broke. When the heresy came, the Emperor's children fell to Slaanesh. The entire Legion, with very few exceptions, chose corruption. The Primarch Fulgrim led his warriors into the service of the Dark Prince. And Rylanor, whose loyalty to the Emperor was unshakable, found himself surrounded by brothers who were no longer brothers in any sense he recognized. He was deployed to Istvan III, taking the place of Captain Sol Tarvitz in the initial assault. The virus bombing of Istvan III killed billions of civilians and the loyalist space marines who could not reach shelter in time, and left Rylanor stranded on the surface of a world that had just been murdered. During the fighting, the ground collapsed beneath the underground hangar he had been ordered to guard, trapping him. His leg was maimed. The last functioning ship on the planet was gone. He could not leave. He stayed there for 10,000 years, not in suspension in a deteriorating dreadnought chassis on a dead and quarantined world, largely immobile, with no brothers and no chapter, and no external confirmation that anything he had fought for still existed. The isolation drove him partly insane. He acknowledged this. What kept him coherent enough to function was not sanity but focus, the single purpose of making Fulgrim answer for what he had done. He spent the 10,000 years constructing a psychic beacon from the sonic weaponry of his fallen brothers, wired to an unexploded virus bomb he had found on the surface. When it was ready, he activated it, not to call the Imperium, but to call Fulgrim. The Daemon Primarch came, drawn by whatever pull a Primarch feels toward unfinished business with his own sons. A trio of Thousand Sons sorcerers came too, sent by Magnus the Red to investigate the beacon's signal. In the ruins of the old command bunker, they found a Dreadnought so ancient and so damaged that it barely resembled the war machine it had once been, and inside it, unmistakably, the warrior who had been placed there before the galaxy broke. Rylanor used the virus bomb. Fulgrim survived, because of course he did. Rylanor did not survive. The Daemon Primarch killed him there on Istvan III, 10,000 years after the betrayal, and in doing so received a psychological wound that Slanesh's own whispers have never been able to heal. The defeat of Rylanor's body was also a defeat of Fulgrim's soul, and that mark persisted. Rylanor is the extreme version of what every Dreadnought pilot carries. The weight of duration, the weight of isolation, the weight of continuing without any external reinforcement for what you are continuing for. Every Dreadnought has this in some measure. Every pilot suspended between battles is, in some very attenuated sense, waiting on an Istvan III of their own, cut off from the full texture of living experience, preserved in the cold fluid, sustaining the mission across a darkness they do not experience as darkness, because in the suspension there is nothing to experience. The difference is that most Dreadnoughts have their chapter around them, and their chapter wakes them and briefs them and stands beside them in the battles and provides the specific kind of continuity that makes the long service bearable. Rylanor had none of that. What he had was the machine and the mission, and 10,000 years, and a plan that did not fully work, and a death that mattered anyway. At its deepest level, a Dreadnought is a promise. The chapter promises the warrior that their service will continue to mean something. The warrior promises the chapter that the service will continue. And in the cases where the promise is kept without external support, without a chapter to wake you and remind you what you are doing and why, those cases reveal whether the promise was ever really the chapter's promise, or whether it was always the warrior's own. In Rylanor's case, it was the warrior's. It always had been. The meaning. The Dreadnought is not a comfortable thing to think about clearly. The Imperium of man is not a comfortable civilization to think about clearly, and the Dreadnought is one of its most honest expressions. It takes the things that are most valued, the greatest warriors, the most irreplaceable veterans, the holders of experience that cannot be reconstructed from records, and it preserves them in a way that also imprisons them, honors them in a way that also costs them everything that living outside a machine would have given them. It does this in the name of necessity, and the necessity is genuine, and the cost is also genuine. And the Imperium does not generally find a way to hold both of those things in the same sentence comfortably. The chaplains who tend the mausolea where the Dreadnoughts sleep between battles approach the subject with a care that is reverence rather than guilt. They maintain the sarcophagi. They check the amniotic fluid levels and the neural link integrity and the suspension systems that will keep the pilot coherent until the next waking. They speak to the suspended warriors in the way that the chapter's traditions indicate is appropriate, not with the expectation of response, but with the understanding that the pilot is still present in some sense, even in suspension, and that the act of speaking is itself an act of connection across the darkness. The warrior who accepted entombment, or who woke up inside the machine and accepted the situation, or who spends his periods of activity in the specific kind of philosophical equilibrium that very old and very experienced beings sometimes reach. This warrior has worked out a relationship with his existence that most people looking at the machine from the outside cannot easily imagine. It is not happiness in the conventional sense. It is something more austere and more durable, a functional relationship with a life that is not what was expected or desired, but that still contains purpose, still contains the specific satisfaction of doing the thing you were made for, even if the manner in which you do it has changed in ways that would have been unimaginable at the beginning. The Space Marines alongside the Dreadnought in the battle line do not see the machine. They see their ancient, their living predecessor, their link to the eras that made the chapter what it is, their colleague in the most complete sense that the word allows, given that the colleague has been doing this longer than any of them have been alive. They see him as he is, moving, present, functional, capable of killing everything in his immediate area with a thoroughness that the living battle brothers can aspire to, but not match. They do not need to resolve the question of whether what he has is a life worth having. That is not their question to answer. His question, his resolution, his machine. The battle awaits. The ancient stirs in the cradle. The chapter's enemies have made the mistake of being in the vicinity of someone who has been fighting them in various forms for a very long time, and who has learned everything there is to learn about how to end engagements efficiently. The suspension releases. The sensor feeds light up. The neural links connect to the engine and the weapons, and the ancient, patient, thoroughly experienced mind begins to assess what needs to be done. It always begins this way. It has always begun this way. There is comfort in that. The Iron Hands and the Ideal. The Iron Hands represent the most philosophically coherent position on the Dreadnought among all the chapters, and understanding it illuminates something essential about what the Dreadnought experience means at its extreme. The Iron Hands have a deep theological investment in the replacement of flesh with machine. This doctrine traces directly to Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands Primarch, whose own hands were encased in living metal, a transformation he did not choose but embraced as evidence of the direction human evolution should be taking. Ferrus Manus believed that flesh was limitation, that the organic was inherently weak and corruptible in ways that the machine was not, and that the progressive augmentation of the warrior's body was not a compromise with human nature, but an improvement upon it. He died at the Horus Heresy. His legion survived, and the doctrine survived with it. An Iron Hands Space Marine in the 41st millennium has more augmetic components than almost any other variant of Space Marine. The process of replacing damaged organic tissue with mechanical equivalents is not a last resort, but a positive choice, made repeatedly over a career of progressively increasing integration with the machine. By the time an Iron Hands veteran is offered entombment in a Dreadnought, he has already spent decades moving in the direction that the Dreadnought represents. The final step, surrendering the last meaningful portion of organic flesh to the sarcophagus, allowing the machine to become his body in the most complete sense available, is understood within the chapter's culture as an achievement rather than a loss. This does not mean the experience of being inside the Dreadnought is different for an Iron Hands pilot than for anyone else. The cold fluid is still cold. The neural links are still intrusive. The loss of sensation is still a loss, regardless of how the theology frames it. What is different is the framework the pilot uses to understand what has happened to him, and the framework matters. It affects how the experience is processed, what emotional register the pilot brings to the centuries of service, how he relates to the brothers who attend the sarcophagus. The Iron Hands pilot who has reached this point has not been forced into a condition he did not want. He has arrived at a destination his chapter told him, from the beginning of his service, was the most honorable place a warrior could reach. Whether that is better or worse than the alternative is a question that different chapters answer differently. The Blood Angel's pilot, who wakes in the Black Rage, is not drawing on a theological framework that prepares him for this outcome. The Space Wolf, who fights until Morkai claims his due, is drawing on a framework that accepts the Dreadnought as a continuation of the warrior tradition, without necessarily reframing it as an achievement. The Iron Hand is the only pilot who can genuinely claim that the machine is, in some meaningful sense, exactly what he wanted. That makes the Iron Hand's Dreadnought's relationship with its own existence the most settled of any variant, and perhaps the most alien to anyone who has not spent a career inside an Iron Hand's doctrine about the inferiority of flesh. It is not enviable in any conventional sense. It is coherent in a way that is its own kind of remarkable. The dead machine and the living warrior. There is a moment that veterans of campaigns involving dreadnoughts sometimes describe, and it is not a comfortable moment, but it is an honest one. When a dreadnought falls in battle, when the accumulated damage from heavy weapons fire or a devastating melee finally crosses the threshold where the chassis can no longer sustain the life support systems, the machine does not simply stop. The pilot continues to function inside it, in the cooling amniotic fluid, for some period after the machine's ability to express his will in the world has ended. He is aware. He cannot move the chassis. He cannot fire the weapons. He cannot speak through the vocalizer because the vocalizer's power supply has gone with the rest of the machine. He is present and he is trapped in a specific new way, not the captivity of the functional dreadnought, which at least allows motion and engagement, but the absolute stillness of a machine that no longer functions with a pilot who is still alive inside it. The Space Marines who rush to recover a fallen dreadnought are not performing a ritual. They are performing a rescue. The weight of what is inside the chassis, the quality of the presence that is still there, makes the effort worthwhile, even when the tactical situation makes it costly. The fallen pilot is returned to the mausoleum. The Tech Marines assess what can be salvaged and what has been lost. If the pilot is still viable, if the suspension systems can be restored and the neural links re-established, he goes back into the mausoleum to wait for the next waking, or for the final rest that the chapter will eventually grant him when the accumulated damage has made continued service no longer possible. If not, the sarcophagus is sealed and placed in the mausoleum as the tomb it always technically was. The warrior inside has finally died. The chapter mourns, genuinely, with the specific quality of grief that belongs to the loss of someone who has been present for a very long time, and whose presence has shaped the chapter in ways that will not become fully apparent until they are no longer there. The death of a venerable dreadnought is the death of a living archive, and the things that were in it, the specific memories, the particular texture of the experience, the exact knowledge of what happened at the founding battle or the siege or the campaign that defined the chapter's character, those things are gone with the pilot. They cannot be recovered from records because they were never in the records. They were in the man. This is the Dreadnought's final statement about what it is. It is not a machine. It is not a relic. It is not a weapon, though it functions as one. It is a man who agreed or was asked or found himself to continue, in a condition that made continuation possible for far longer than nature intended, in service to a cause that requires more than nature is willing to give. The cause is worth more than nature is willing to give. This is the Imperium's position, and the Imperium holds it consistently, and the Dreadnought is its most concentrated expression. Whether the pilots agree is something the living cannot fully know, because the pilots have been inside the machines for longer than the living have been alive. And the perspective that duration produces is not a perspective that translates easily across the gap between those who have experienced it and those who are trying to understand it from the outside. What can be said is that the battles keep getting won. The chapter keeps its ancients. The ancients keep waking when they are called. The machine walks. The pilot inside it is still alive. That's the whole thing. That's enough.